All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. Secondly, I have now the graveyard slot in a way. In two respects. First of all, I'm the last one today, or we are the last ones today, I should say. As you see, that's a joint paper by me and my colleague Johannes Schmidt of Düsseldorf. But it's also, when we were trying to put this together, we were a bit worried about all the other people who would come ahead of us. So we decided, and that's my first remark, we decided to limit this party system analysis on anti-European parties. I should say straight away that most of our results would probably work for the broader family of TAN parties or right-wing populist parties, and I very much take this point that we have a problem of easily calling them right-wing. So that's the first remark I mainly talk about, when I look at parties, I talk about parties opposed to Europe. Now, our point of departure was that, of course, and that's been said today, that the shock of the Euro crisis politicized European integration, and as a result, we see a lot of shifts. Some parties began to reconsider their stance on Europe, and other parties emerged in response to the Euro crisis. And we take a long-term perspective on party system change and mainly present data on volatility and party system fragmentation covering the entire post-war period or the period since democratic transformation in Central and Eastern Europe. And I conclude with a few remarks on the relationship between support for these parties and the support for democracy in a wider sense. Now let's start with the first slide on volatility, and as I said, this includes all elections since the post-war period, the democratic post-war period began, and you can easily see two pictures here. The first one is that not much happens, not much change seems to happen between before the crisis and after the crisis in Central and Eastern Europe, but it is very different when we look at Western Europe alone. We see that virtually all high volatility elections, according to our cutoff points, they happen after the crisis 2007. There's another way of looking at volatility by just looking at so-called replacement volatility or type A volatility. And again, except for one election, I think this is the Italian election in the transition from the First to the Second Republic, in inverted commas, all these high volatility, high replacement volatility elections take place after 2007. And there are some examples, and of course, when you look at volatility alone, and I will not spend much time on the examples here, of course, it goes down once new parties enter. Typical example, Spain, two new parties come along, and then it goes down again. Greece is another example. Has this really changed the format of party systems? And here we talk mainly about we talk largely about Western Europe, because in Eastern Europe the situation has been so fluid that that would require a different kind of perspective. So if we look at the relationship between volatility and fragmentation, we again see that it's mainly a Western European, and we heard this before in other papers, it's mainly a Western European story. And here you see all the post-war elections. On the vertical axis, you see fragmentation, that is the effective number of parties, and is always the deviation from the long-term mean. That's important to remember. We do this also in a number of other slides. And on the horizontal axis, you see again centered, that is deviation from the long-term mean volatility, and we clearly see that there's more happening in the upper right quadrant in Western Europe, whereas Central Eastern Europe is a different story. And again, I show you a couple of examples. Here we see that some of the sort of party system changing elections are clearly after the beginning of the crisis. And as we know, in Spain it was a bit later, 2008. obviously one can argue about the cutoff point of 2007, 2008 was still a fairly normal election. And then we see that the party system changes quite substantially. And as we reach 2016, we have an effective number of parties of 4.8. Those are the real figures. Those are not deviations from the mean. So it goes from 2.6 to 4.8. Similar picture, incomplete, because we couldn't wait for the Italian election. The Italian situation, where fragmentation has increased and also volatility has gone up. Even the hyper-stable Germany, and we see that all the post-crisis elections are in this upper right-hand quadrant, and we have now reached an effective number of parties of 5.1 in 2017. Netherlands, a similar picture. As I said, I don't want to spend too much time on these examples. Greece, of course, a huge upheaval in the party system in 2012, and then as time goes by, it gets a bit more normal in inverted commas. But we see on these, I've just sort of zoomed in on a few of these countries, we see that there's a relatively profound change in the party systems related to volatility and ongoing fragmentation. Now, let's move beyond the prima facie evidence on the impact of the euro crisis on party systems by directly looking at the electoral fortunes of Eurosceptic parties as they are identified by the Chapel Hill data set. And here we see, for the sake of completeness, I have also included the British Conservatives. I know this is debatable. That's the upper blue line here. But we see that it's not a very clear picture, but by and large, we see, of course, an increase, and we've seen this just in the previous paper. There's an increase in anti-European party vote. The other real outlier is the other two real outliers are mainly the French and the Austrian radical right parties or populist parties, because they have been around for much longer, so there's also more fluctuation here. Again, some of the examples, the AfD, we've talked about this at length before, the Five-Star Movement, one of them, even though I should say, they have sort of backtracked a little bit on anti-European things, but probably we hear this more the more recent news on this from Stefano Bartolini later on. That's the Danish party, the Danish Freedom Party. Danish Freedom Party. That's the Austrian party, and again here we see a fluctuation. They had an electoral peak much earlier. Now, what does this tell us? And that is our major analytical focus. What does this tell us with regard to the support for democracy? And here we've taken data from the European Social Survey, from the waves as they are available, and that limits our number of cases a little bit, I should say, because we want to present longitudinal data. Now, the first message is that we have no conspicuous increase in Western Europe in the mean dissatisfaction with democracy. We have actually done similar, we have done the same analysis with trust in politicians and in parties, but the data is more complete if we take satisfaction with democracy, so that is a reasonably good proxy for these other questions for our purposes. So what we see here is not only support for democracy overall, but we can also interpret this as a support for party democracy as we initially intended when we started to work on this paper. Now what we see here is that this sorting effect, as we call it, has increased over time. That means party vote is more clearly related to whether you are satisfied with democracy as a voter or whether you are dissatisfied. So over time, we see a clear increase in this sorting effect, in the squared R. The real outlier, and that's interesting, so I want to highlight this, is this blue dot on the 2016. That is Poland, where we see that the party system now does an incredibly strong job in sorting the voters according whether you like it or whether you hate it. Either you like the present government or you really hate it. So that's a real outlier. Now, that's the overall picture. Now we have looked in more detail on some of the country examples, and I show you some typical cases of sorting. As I said, for that analysis, we mainly stay in the Western European countries, but in the paper we have a wider list of countries. Now that is Sweden, a pending election, and all I know about the opinion surveys in Sweden, we are very likely to see a strong result of the Sweden Democrats, which are not only anti-European but also anti-immigrant, so there would be a classic case of a radical Tan party. And if you look at these blue bars on the left, we see that satisfaction with democracy hasn't fluctuated or changed conspicuously. If you go to the right, we see that the squared R with the party vote has really gone up, so the sorting effect has more or less monotonously increased. And when we look at the very right of this table at the difference of means, that is the mean satisfaction or mean dissatisfaction among the different parties' electorates, and the Sweden Democrats are the party that attracts the most dissatisfied voters, and that goes up over time. Similar picture in Germany, coming back to the AfD. No real change in satisfaction with democracy, but as the AfD comes along, a fairly strong sorting effect. Those who are unhappy with the way the system works, they tend to vote for the alternative for Germany. Very strong coefficients, very strong figures here. And just to show you this, that's a different data source. That's the German longitudinal election study. If you look at the parties' electorates, you see this also quite clearly. It's basically that most of the AfD voters, and to a lower degree, to a lower extent, the left-wing voters, they have a strong component of voters who are not very satisfied with democracy, whereas the mainstream parties, the picture is very, very different. Of course, there are deviant cases. One of them is, or not of course, but there are different deviant cases. One of them is France. The National Front has been along for so long, so that we see here, and that has probably a lot to do, and we need to look at this more carefully, with changing strategies of the National Front leadership and the way the party has positioned itself. But here we see that the sorting effect fluctuates. But again, there's no huge change over time in the mean satisfaction with democracy in France. And the FPÖ, again, one of these cases which have been around for a long time. Same picture, no conspicuous change in satisfaction with democracy, fluctuation on the sorting effect. But I should also say, and that's not in the presentation, but in the paper, of all the parties and elections we look at, there's only one single election where the electorate for these anti-European parties is not more dissatisfied than the electorates of other parties. Now, some concluding remarks. Now, what does this mean for democracy and for support for democracy in Europe? I think there are, and that relates, and what I say now is something that we could, one could also argue for a broader family of not just anti-EU parties, but generally right-wing populist or radical Tan parties. I think there are two possible scenarios. First, the rise of such challenger parties could induce if we assume that there's also a representation gap in the political system, that some of the issues that people feel strongly about are not adequately dealt with the mainstream parties. So the rise of challenger parties should induce a certain degree of responsiveness, and then that could actually lead to a growth in satisfaction overall with democracy and party democracy. So that's the positive scenario. I think there's equally good reasons to be worried about the second scenario, in which the rise of such challenger parties leads to a legitimation of previously unacceptable arguments. Here I've written in inverted commas populist arguments, but you know what I mean. Breaking down the barriers of decency in the public debate, etc., and that could lead to a further growth and dissatisfaction, and here I put in inverted commas, that could lead to what Sartori has called a polarized pluralism. I think to a certain degree both scenarios are plausible. It depends on the response of also the established political actors and on the specific circumstances in individual countries. So I don't think there's a clear-cut trajectory, and a lot depends on political agency, on the behavior of political elites. Thank you.